Hello, everyone. So glad to have all of you here on this Friday evening. With us today, we have Chinmayi from the Bachao Project. We're so happy to have you, Chinmayi, here today. The Bachao Project, for folks that don't know, is a techno-feminist collective that works towards that undertakes a lot of community-centric efforts to develop to develop and support open source technologies and frameworks with a goal of mitigating gender-based violence and working towards equal rights for all minority groups, including women, LGBTQ plus folks, and gender diverse persons. If folks who are here have not had the time to take a look at it, the Bachao Project has actually developed a manual for building in inclusivity and tech into technology, into building technological products with a focus on inclusivity and development. A little bit of background about Chinmay as well before we get started completely. Chinmay is a graduate in computer science and has founded the Bachao project and has been running it since 2013, if I'm correct. He has previously worked as an engineer at Nokia and has also founded Sakshi, which is a software services startup based in Bangalore, India. She currently spends most of her time supporting technology research and community building for nonprofits in both in India and globally. And basically, she has experience in building technology, interdisciplinary research, designing training modules for organizations and communities. And today, and nobody better than her to tell us about how we can build in inclusivity and diversity into tech products that are currently being built. And this is particularly a very important conversation to have, and everything around us has become very tech centric at this point. So this is a great time to for all of us to imbibe a lot of these things. So yeah, over to you, Chinmay. I'm so sorry for taking up so much of your time.
No, thank you. And that's very high praise. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm probably not the best, but I have some experience and I'm trying to share it with you. Hopefully, all of you gain something from it. So when Charu asked, and actually when Aviyel approached and asked that talk about developing technology for diversity and inclusion, I was very happy because this is something that we've been working on for 7-8 years. So I started out as an engineer, and basically for me, I had no training whatsoever in social sciences when I started out. I started out as a pure engineer, as someone who has the engineering skills, who has been taught software development, software engineering processes, but very little on the social aspects of the technology in itself. So when I started working with this organization called Random Hacks of Kindness, I started working on technology which affected people and would probably help people, would probably support people. And that's when I started learning about how do you build technology that is useful, that is inclusive, and that considers diversity. And in my say 7-8 years of working with social issues and sometimes building technology, sometimes working with platforms and training people on those platforms, sometimes doing research on what would be apt kind of technologies, or what are the rights of people, or how are platforms infringing on those rights. What I've learned very importantly is that the first step to building any technology is that you got to listen. You have to start listening to people. You have to center them. You have to basically leave your ego aside and start listening to people. That's where you start. It's not with the platform. It is not with what language. It is not with how open source or closed source I am. Uh, yes, they all come in later. There's things that you can think of later, but first thing that you have to do is start listening to people you're building it for. They, how do you do it? There are various ways to do it. First things is that not dismissing somebody's need. When you're building a platform for a particular group, first thing, reach out to that group and speak to them about, this is what I'm planning to build. Is this even useful to you? Many times, the things that we think about building, which are not for ourselves, are usually not a necessity or a priority for the groups we think of for building. So, very important for us to evaluate whether what we're building is the right thing for the group or is a necessity for the group, even before we start building. That's where you start. Once you've asked that question, once you know that you're building something that's right for a group, that's right for a community, then you start by including them, right? So, how do you do it? You do it with the training of an engineer. You can start with the training of an engineer. You can do it many other ways, but since you are thinking of this as a technologist or an engineer, then you think about how you were trained. You were trained with software engineering processes. You were trained with thinking about different models of software engineering. Some were collaborative, some were hierarchical, some were not collaborative. That's okay. Choose processes that you're comfortable with and then go from there. Once you do that, what you need to think about is there are four aspects, right, in a software engineering process: design, architecture, testing, right? And then you release. So broadly, and of course, there are a lot of other processes which change from each model to another. Each software engineering model is different. But then broadly, these are the four aspects. So the first process that you do is design. And to think about design, there are like I said, there are ways to design. One is to build an model like a MVP yourself and then test it out. Or the other is to kind of include people in your design process. So there are defined design processes. One is a collaborative design, one is participatory design, and the third is co-design. These design processes have been practiced by design professionals for years. So you can use these processes to work with your stakeholder groups to build and design out whatever platform, whatever issue that you are solving. So in each of these design processes, uh, there is a module where you can invite the stakeholder group. In, say, participatory design, it's a different, you build as you go and you have the stakeholder groups trying out as you go. In a co-design, you have the stakeholder groups designing it with you. So similarly, you have these design processes. You can use them as a way for you to think about design. You can also make use of certain design networks like Design Justice Network or Design, like for in India, Design Beku is one of the networks which does this kind of design justice sort of work. So you can find these groups which work on the principles of working with communities without actually dismissing their needs or pressing them further, instead including them in their design. So this would be for the design aspect of your platform in itself. And then you move on to the next aspect, which is the architecture. So when you're thinking of the architecture, then you think about, sorry, I'm just coming back to my stop sharing. Yeah. So once you have a design sort of finalized, you can think about architecture. Architecture in terms of like, uh, would it be centralized? Would it be decentralized? Depending on who is the stakeholder group that you're working with. Some of the stakeholder groups, a centralized architecture is the best in terms of how it is accessible for people in the group. But for some of the groups, a decentralized architecture is the best. For example, if you are thinking of an identity project, then I wouldn't recommend a centralized architecture for an identity project. So, because there are multiple points of failure for an identity project, and it deeply impacts somebody and their livelihood. So, you need to have uh, that fail-safe mechanisms to support the project. So that's where I wouldn't use the centralized architecture. I would decentralize it. So when you're building for a issue and a solution, look about the architecture should take into account. One is how not just the design aspect of it, and the design aspect should include about usage as well, usability as well, not just the look and feel. Look and feel would be one, and it's very important to look at the look and feel and accessibility, yes, but it's also important for you to look at usability a little bit more when you as and when you build for different kinds of groups. um, so the usability would definitely take into account of the day-to-day patterns of these people. So if, for example, somebody is using a phone for four members of the household, sharing one phone, and they're using this to access their everyday welfare schemes and their banking needs, say, then you're thinking about not an app, a banking app, which would be uh, tied to one single device. Instead, you would be thinking about how this banking app can be used by multiple users in the group securely, in such a way that session on session it closes down, and then you secure that user account instead of keeping it insecure and tying it to one phone, right? So depending on like the lifestyle of a person, depending on the groups that you're working with, you have to think about these elements and build your architecture out based on those elements themselves. So that's the second thing that you tackle. Once you do a collaborative design processes, you identify the needs and actually build out your architecture. Third is then you would move on to infrastructure of the platform. And when you're looking at infrastructure of the platform, uh, it is very important to do end-to-end testing. What I mean by end-to-end testing is not just do testing for your platform on certain aspects of it, like not just testing your if you're writing a server-side program for the platform that you're building, not just doing server-side testing, making sure that it works well, but it's also about doing like if you're building out for a mobile device, you test it out on uh, how it works end to end in the different conditions that people work with. So, for example, uh, yeah, let's take the banking app example in itself. Um, you do an excellent job of building a nice app. You have the server side setup, and you have an say an browser side sort of an login interface for it. Uh, But then you've tested out the browser side login interface for it. You've tested out the site on your mobile app, which is which is probably on your phone, uh, and you've tested out the server side. But it's also important that you test out on different networks. So in your definition of just end-to-end testing, also including these variables that you would not normally include for using a low bandwidth network, using different networks. That's something that you have to start inculcating as a practice for when you're doing uh, the kind of testing that you're doing, and then decide on your infrastructure. So you can think about what sort of infrastructure do you want to use, something that loads quickly on the mobile, or do you want to use something that loads probably a little later, but it's more reliable? It should depend on what sort of functionality you're building and who you're building it for, and what sort of support it gives, right? For sometimes the infrastructure you use is not supportive of the languages that people use in. So thinking about these parameters while thinking about your infrastructure is an important part. Um, Moving on, we spoke about infrastructure. I am now moving to the next aspect, which is data in itself. So, working especially with uh, platforms which are storing using user data and basically sharing this data is a tricky part, but it's also kind of become an essential or second nature for most of the technology that we build today. So it's very essential for us to think about data, um, especially when you're thinking about data collection and usage in India, in because India does not have adequate data protection laws as of now, which means that uh, basically for someone using any platform, if you're an engineer building that platform, uh, you and you do not build your architecture in such a way that minimizes the risk around data, you're basically putting people at risk. So thinking about data is very, very essential, especially when you're working with marginalized groups, especially when you're working with people who are at risk, because the marginalized groups are very much more at risk than um, everybody else. And so it's very, very important to think about it. Um, so, how do you think about it? So, data can be taught about in three aspects. Um, Going back to this, you can think about one, the data before collection, while collecting it, and post to collecting it. So basically, when you are collecting data, like you say you want to give them a platform for, now Aviyel built a platform for its users to interact, right? It had and it had this login uh, for users, probably a good measure because you want to have a healthy community, so you have to have a way to moderate the community. Uh, but then in doing so, Aviyel is collecting your some form of data. So, how does Aviyel want to collect data? What kind of information Aviyel wants to collect is the planning of pre-life. Then life would be once Aviyel collects this, say, login IDs or email IDs as such, and it is using that to provide certain access rights, to provide certain um, actions or privileges. That is a part of the life of the data. So, what you do with the data, how you interact with the data, you consider that as life. And basically, now I have come to this platform, Aviyel. I have spoken on this event. Now, tomorrow, I do want to not continue using Aviyel, say. Then Aviyel at some point decides to shift the platform or change the platform or close the platform. Then what happens to my data is the afterlife. So thinking about whenever you're building a platform, thinking about before you collect the data, before you ask for the data, asking certain questions like, is this data necessary? What would I use it for? That's what you determine in your pre-life. In your life, you think about the interactions that you're doing with the data and how much of those interactions are secure. So that is the life with the data and your interactions in that. And afterlife is like, what do you do with the data once you've served a purpose? For example, Aviyel decides that, oh, the community is vibrant enough, it has good number of people working on open source, diverse set of people working on open source. So maybe our function ends here. So what does this platform then do with the data? Do they keep on storing it? Do they delete it? How do they store it? That is afterlife of the data. All these three things are important, uh, especially when you are thinking about database systems for marginalized groups. Um, okay, so I've quickly ran through like the four aspects that I might want to cover in this presentation. And I want to go a little bit more deeper into each of the aspect. So let's start with design, right? So design, um, what are, um, we will look at some of the design patterns. We will not look at everything, of course, but we will look at what might be essential patterns to include, especially when you're building for diversity and inclusion. So start with EULA. Any platform that you build that has users, you have uh, a EULA. And a EULA, though mandated by law in certain countries, it's also a generalized practice otherwise, right? So whenever you're building this EULA, it's very essential that you create an effective EULA. Most of the times, what happens with EULA is that you just have like pages and pages together of legalese, and you don't know what you're accepting with, or you don't know what is happening with you, or you don't know how what is going to uh, be happening with your data, how are you going to be monitored, all of those things which are of very much the concern of groups which are usually marginalized. Considering that they have been historically um, watched over, surveilled, it is very essential that whenever you're creating the systems, you make them feel safer. So how do you do this? Within EULA, try and be as crisp as possible. but also giving in as much information as possible. For example, this is one of the platforms that I'm screenshotting. This is an older screenshot, of course. Like, I haven't gotten a new screenshot of this, but this platform supports women who deal with domestic abuse. So it is very essential for women who are working on this platform to look at their cases, to know, like, okay, I'm using this platform, how can I trust this platform? So adding elements of um, uh, I would say worry into elements of trust is very important. Like, for example, if you're working with domestic abuse survivors, one of the things is that how easily their information can be accessible by someone, how much of their data can be secured. Because abusers can be very aggressive in their approaches to trying to find information. So when they're trying to protect themselves, they're very much concerned about how much this using this platform will put them at risk. So talking about it in the first page might be a good idea. Then also, like, in terms of, if you're thinking about inclusion and if you're thinking about accessibility, having pages together of reading material might not be the best accessible solution for everyone. So keeping, like, you could look at this app called Uni. They have they collect censorship data, right? So most of the people that use the app could be at risk of using the app. So what they do is they beautifully, sorry, I don't have screenshots here, but you can open the app and install and try and see. So when you install it, they ask a series of questions. They ask you about, like, do you know the risk of using this app, and run users through the risk of using the app. So in a way, informing users of the risk through 4 or 5 clicks as such. So that way the users can choose whether this is something they are prepared for, or this is something that they would like to not use at all. So this is where you start helping the users make a decision. This is your starting point in any sort of user-based apps. Second, basically, the second design that you need to think about is consent policies. There have been several conversations about consent, what is an acceptable consent. Over the years, it's just become a discussion point where people have started talking about, like, consent in various formats. Um, Everyone agrees that I agree to a EULA or I agree to terms of conditions is not necessarily informed consent. And there have been discussions of how to navigate through informed consent. So if you've not heard of the word of informed consent, uh, that's the first thing you need to learn, especially when you are building any platform where consent is necessary, where, especially if you're dealing with anything that is got to do with data, then you have to learn about this term called informed consent. What it means is that you are providing necessary information for the user to understand what they're consenting to. And how do you do it? This is one of the frameworks for consent policies, which is found in the Responsible Data Forum. And it's a very good guide to how do you think about consent, right? So first and foremost is tell them what you can provide, what you cannot provide. See, for example, if you cannot tell them that, if your email, if the server is hacked, I won't be able to inform you. Please let them know this right away. Instead of setting false expectations. The reason being, here again, you are mostly dealing with people who might be at risk. I'm using the word might. So, who might be at risk. And it's very important for you to tell them that you can do this and you cannot do this. Uh, in a way, you're being transparent about the risk they're facing, and you giving them the choice to make the decision. Then talk about data use. um, we talked about this concept of afterlife, right? So in afterlife, I told you about, like, you need to make a decision about what do you do about the data after your platform is closing, right? Similarly, it's possible that even when your platform is running, how long do you keep data, and what is it for? Being transparent about it. I was looking into some reproductive health apps, and Philips, for example, had built an health app. Uh, and the thing is, even if you did use the health app for 6 months, 6 to 9 months, ideally during your pregnancy, the app said that it would keep the data for almost 4 years after this. So I don't see why an app which is helping you monitor your pregnancy of 9 months should keep your data for 4 years. So thinking about time and usage, right? So, like, if the app is built to monitor pregnancy, then one of the responsible things for you to do is that to end that data collection, data storage at the end of the term. There have been several cases. For example, like, there have been pregnancy monitor app which have sent notifications to parents who've just lost a kid, saying, "Oh, you have not updated the stats of your child." So, thinking about those things, like if you're building a pregnancy health app, also providing a non-intrusive notification, or not providing notification asking the parent to provide those details. They provide, well and good. If not, maybe not. Don't remind them of their dead child. So that's what you need to think. This is like putting your thought into what could be the scenarios that would cause someone pain and avoiding those scenarios. Um, Also, most importantly, whenever you're making these promises of like security, making these promises of like, or doing any data collection, please think very much about like organizational capacity. Like, if you're a one person managing this app, maybe you don't have the time to look at all sorts of security for the app. So keep them to limited functionality and limited features. Don't build out extensively and you can't maintain or ensure that sort of data security, which is a crappy behavior in itself. So those are some things that you can think out when writing consent policies, and make this explicit. If you're a one-person team, it's okay. You build a platform, but make sure you tell them that this is what I can guarantee you, this is what I can't guarantee you. And please, whenever you see that any of your platforms have been compromised, have a disclosure policy that informs the users, uh, as in when you know of it. So this is very important to have. If you are unable to do this, then do not do data collection. Do not collect unnecessary data. There is a minimalized data, the concept of minimal data collection, which is collect only data that you need, not what you want, because we all want to keep collecting data, keep using, thinking we'll use it like 5 years later, not 5 years, 5 months later, but 5 years later we still have that data and we don't do anything about it. So think about that. Okay, now that I've spoken about consent policies, now that I've spoken about EULA, let me talk to you about one other thing which is essential as an design element that you use in your platform, especially when you're working for inclusion diversity, and that is feedback channels. Uh, you need to have a way for people to communicate with you, for people to tell you how they felt about your platform, to people to inform you about any issues with the platform. And this is very, 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 very important, especially if you're thinking of inclusion. Uh, you have to make it available in all the languages that you provide your platform in, and many more depending on where your users from. Make it simple. Don't ask them to go on a GitHub and report issues. That is not for everyone. Don't ask them to go to Bugzilla and report issues. Not for everyone. Give them an option for reporting in the way that they're comfortable, right? Encourage them. For example, I really like this platform, and that's how I took a screenshot of it. Basically, this one provides like a text box for feedback. Usually people are uh, they like to have the variable width, especially when they're giving feedback. Some like to give a line feedback. Someone like me, I would just say, oh, I do not like this specific thing in a line or two, and close the feedback. But uh, somebody else might like to tell a story about like what they did, why they were using this, and why they encountered this. You have to make space for all sorts of users. That's when you will be able to build a better platform. I know it's a little bit of more work to read through the feedback, to pass through the feedback, yes, but if do you want to include people in your platform, you want people to start using your platform, you need to also build that relationship with them. So feedback channels are super important. If not a form, have a WhatsApp group. Not a WhatsApp group, WhatsApp number, which probably somebody can respond to. Uh, I mean, WhatsApp is not useful for every sort of platform, but it sure is one of the widespread sort of messaging app. So if you're, say, building a platform for women who are doing small businesses, then WhatsApp is perfect for such a platform. So you can use things that, like earlier, I was talking to you about not this, but infrastructure. You can use infrastructure that works with the groups that you're working with, rather than using infrastructure that you're comfortable with. So here you have to walk away a little bit from your comfort zone and make it useful for the users. That's what I would say. Okay. Having spoken about feedback channels, I want to move to the other design element, which is interactivity. I spoke about usability, but interactivity is also as much helpful. As much necessary. Um, Not in all aspects, but certain aspects. For example, This is an old reporting screenshot of Twitter. And this is a reporting, um, these are choices that Twitter provides. Uh, if you're building a platform, say a social media platform, or if you're building a platform where there is high degree of or high volume of social interaction, it's also important that you build this interaction in every aspect of that platform. So, not just about making it welcoming for people to just talk, but also to be able to block out people, to be able to moderate people, to be able to report people. These are things that you have to think about. All the supporting functionality and supporting functionality specifically for harm reduction. You have to remember that whenever you're building for diversity, whenever you're building for inclusion, marginalized groups usually need the most support. Actually, they need the most support. And usually, in a platform, when you have everybody involved, it's there is a high degree that you have social behavior, which is bad behavior. So you have to plan for it, and you have to think about how robust you're making those mechanisms. Like for this, reporting mechanism is not at all robust. It's speaking about like being disrespectful or offensive, pretending to be me or someone else. But that's the only category. The first category is the only category which talks about abuse. But abuse comes in so many forms. Uh, and choosing this will not help me articulate what kind of abuse I'm facing at all. So, thinking about those things is very essential. Okay, um, how are we on time?
I
We're running okay? Okay, so we can go back. Sorry. Um, okay, we spoke about uh, few things which are parts of your platform. There are features for your platform. There are practices for designing. But as a technologist, as a coder, you'd be like, all this is good. How do I kind of um, also ensure my coding practices are um, up to date? Sorry, are not creating these issues, right? So there are several identified biases uh, in how we build out platforms or how we write code for platforms. So specifically, like um, whenever you're building something, not necessarily technical platform, but any platform, right? You build from your experience most of the times, unless you've used the processes that I detailed earlier for design, where you're including people in building your platform. You usually have certain kind of biases, and these basically also uh, go to every aspect of your building the platform. So it's important for you to have a very good uh, peer review setup. And when you are having peer review setup, it's important for you to not just have peer reviewers for the quality of code, which is one thing, but it's important to also have peer reviewers looking at your biases. So, uh, if you're building out um, some sort of um, way of interaction, uh, thinking about like accessibility and how that plays out into your interaction is probably something that you need to look at. Or if you're thinking of like, oh, okay, this is, I'm building this app for someone monitoring their pregnancy. So why don't I say, why don't I you take information about their mood and build out uh, an set of options for the mood. Say, I'm feeling low, or I'm feeling like eating a certain kind of food. So those are things that you've learned through uh, your life experience, but not necessarily are true. So avoid using your life experience to build out the code or to build out the features in the code. So having someone to review your code based on these biases is a good thing. You can screenshot these biases, start reading about them. You can also ask your peer reviewers to see if they have experience looking at this from a social setting. If not, you can always invite a peer reviewer who has experience of looking at these biases and work with your existing peer reviewer to look at the code in itself. So that's one tip for how do you think about biases. Um this is what I had planned for today, but so I can stop right here, and I want to hear from you and answer to those questions. But if you want to read more in depth, then like Charu said, we have the manual on the Bachao Project website. It's available for reading, and it's on GitHub. I think I can put the link here. Do you have the link on this thing? No, right? I can put the link here. But yeah, I think I want to stop talking now. And actually, I like to do this more interactive. If it was more a physical meeting, then I would be like trying to know what platforms you're trying to build and talk about it from that perspective. But yeah, I wanted to give you some base theory to go on. But I also would like to know if there are certain other things that folks were interested in learning, or like they faced any certain problems while they were building out their platforms.
Yep, I think we can wait for a minute or two and see if
Mm-hmm.
there are any questions coming in. But in the meanwhile, I was just wondering, I think a lot of the things that you pointed out, and even keeping Aviyel as an example throughout, are things that, we can pick up while building our platform as well. And a lot of these things, since we're still in our beta stage and we're still building, I think a lot of them are stuff that we should be and we will, start inculcating within our platform as well. So, yeah, I think we can wait for a minute or
Okay.
two to see if um, folks, if you have any questions, you can drop it in the chat box on the right hand side of your screen.
Was it too much, too dense for everyone,
Yes.
or were there things that you could take back?
Yeah, I think definitely, coming from a non-tech background myself, I was able to understand most of the things. So I think, you covered everything with a solid, you know, you explained everything pretty well because,
Okay.
yeah.
Oh, thank you, Ivan. That's definitely helpful to know. The feedback is always helpful. If the other attendees have any other feedback, and if you want to reach out later, also you can reach out through Charu, or you can just write. That's okay. But if you have questions right now, or if you're building a platform and you want me to, like, look at specific platform, I'm happy to do that as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I will, and I think Chinmay will definitely would love to have answer any of your questions if you have them later. So you can send it through us, and we can definitely get back to you with that. But other than that, if we have no questions, I think we can close the event for the today. Thank you so much, Chinmay, for the session. It was wonderful hosting you on Aviyel. We're looking forward to for many of you who may not know, just giving a sneak peek into what we're planning to do is building a similar manual for open source projects. And because building technology with a focus of diversity and inclusion is something key to not just technology and software projects in general, but since a lot of for open source projects particularly, since there are very few women within these communities, but a lot of the users are women. So this is definitely something that we are looking to work with the Bachao project for. And thank you so much, Chinmay, for doing this for us. But yeah, it was an amazing.
Thank you for Thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to working more with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I guess we can close the event for today in that case then. Bye, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in.